my name is Kelly Rezak, and I serve as the Wildlife Diversity Coordinator for the Missouri Department of Conservation. I'm really excited to see all of these partners from across the Mississippi Flyway come together to talk about grasslands and opportunities to collaborate for grassland conservation. And I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to participate. Grassland conservation has been identified as a priority by multiple regional conservation efforts. The MAFWA State Wildlife Action Plan Technical Committee identified grassland conservation among its 3 highest priorities for regional collaboration in 2016. In 2017, AFWA established the Grassland Work Group to address the urgent plight of North America's grasslands with a focus on grassland birds. Grassland natural communities have declined across the U.S., especially in the tallgrass region, and are the most threatened natural communities identified in the state wildlife action plans of most states within the Mississippi Flyway region. In recent years, attention is focused on the decline of grassland birds and pollinators. The declines documented in these taxa are shocking and compel a response. Grasslands are very rich and diverse communities, supporting a wide range of plant and animal species in every taxonomic category. So for this introductory talk, I wanted to introduce the rich faunal diversity of the eastern grasslands, consider threats common across this diversity, and explore opportunities for grassland conservation efforts to benefit this full suite of faunal diversity. Probably safe to assume that grassland SGCN are included in the state wildlife action plans of every Mississippi Flyway state. But because of differences among states and how grassland habitats are described and how habitat associations are assigned, calculating the number of SGCN associated with grasslands within this region or the taxonomic diversity was more challenging than I first expected. I asked Catherine Ward, an assistant natural history biologist, to use the USGS SGCN database to estimate the proportion of SGCN in the Mississippi Flyway states that are associated with grasslands. Habitat association data weren't available or easily obtainable for every state, and in some cases, treed systems such as savannas, glades, or pine communities were categorized as grasslands. Because this work group has chosen to focus on open grasslands for this exercise, we also tried to focus on calculating the proportion of SGCN associated with open grasslands in the Mississippi Flyway for those states with easily obtainable data. Based on that rough, limited analysis, it appears that grassland SGCN make up roughly 16% of the SGCN identified for the 9 states that were included. Our key focus for this work group will begin our survey there. A landmark study of all bird monitoring data over the past 50 years documented a staggering loss of abundance, 3 billion birds since 1970. This study, published in Science, is receiving global media attention. The 2019 U.S. State of the Birds report uses this science to highlight the critical role of state wildlife agencies in addressing the bird and wildlife crisis in America and supporting Recovering America's Wildlife Act. A coalition of bird conservation organizations is launching the Bird Crisis Campaign to sound the alarm and promote action. Key messages and digital media assets are available at the shared partner website, 3billionbirds.org. The Rosenberg study shows a 50% loss in grassland breeding birds since 1970, more than any other North American breeding biome. These declines aren't limited to rare birds. Many of our most common and well-known species are declining. These graphs show breeding bird survey data trends from 49 years for 6 relatively common grassland bird species. These are birds so ubiquitous across tall grass systems that the idea that they could be at risk is shocking, even to those who have been tracking the loss of grassland habitat. So much so that a new category has been created, common birds in steep decline, to represent species that are still abundant compared to many other species, but are declining at alarming rates. Similarly, the State of Canada's birds report indicated a 57% decline in grassland birds since 1970, second only to the 59% decline in aerial insectivores. Encouragingly, this report also shows a substantial increase in waterfowl populations, which have benefited from several decades of intensive management for hunting and conservation. We'll come back to that later. Birds are more well studied than any other taxonomic group. It's quite probable that the documented declines in grassland birds is reflective of an overall decline in grassland extent and diversity. Pollinators have attracted quite a bit of attention recently, but as with other insects, they're among the least studied taxa. Much of the information we have on pollinator and insect populations reflects how little we truly know about these species. Case in point, rattlesnake master borer moth was petitioned for listing when it was only known to occur in only a few sites in 5 states. It's a nondescript species of moth that's very difficult to distinguish from other species in its genus. Once targeted surveys were conducted, multiple populations were found to occur across several states, including Missouri and Kansas. And 17 of those populations are considered highly resilient. As a result, the service recently determined that listing was not warranted for this species. Without a long history of monitoring data like we have for birds, it's impossible to know how much insect populations have declined. However, there are clues to the trends of grassland insect and pollinator populations in general from the trends of the more well-studied species such as monarch butterfly and regal fritillary. The loss of grassland habitat negatively affects all grassland-dependent species, or for those species dependent upon a single species or genera of plant host for part of their life cycle, such as some butterflies and moths. The loss of grassland diversity is as great a threat as the loss of grassland abundance. We see this in the decline of monarch butterflies, which face many threats, including loss of overwintering habitat and increased use of pesticides. But the greatest threat has been attributed to the loss of milkweeds on the landscape. Planting restored grasslands with highly diverse seed mixtures helps establish diversity, but management is required to continue to promote and maintain that diversity. As grassland parcels shrink, management becomes more difficult, particularly the use of prescribed fire, which is one of the most effective tools we have for promoting grassland diversity. Many of these insect species that require diverse grassland habitats are also sensitive to fire, such as the endangered Carner blue butterfly, and the regal fritillary, which is vulnerable to fire in all life stages year-round. Therefore, to maintain insect and pollinator diversity, it is essential to leave unburned refugia by burning no more than 1/3 of a grassland parcel each year and allowing burns to be patchy. But dividing small grassland parcels into even smaller burn units can be challenging and inefficient for managers. Incorporating the needs of the better understood insects into grassland management plans is challenging by itself, but in most cases, little is known about the management needs of grassland insects or how they even respond to restoration efforts. So we fine-tuned the restoration process to maximize plant diversity within reconstructions to more closely resemble remnant prairies. And we've documented positive responses by grassland obligate birds within these plantings. But how are insect communities responding to these restoration efforts? To begin to address this question, the Missouri Department of Conservation designed a project to gather baseline data regarding the distribution of several conservative insect species among 3 grassland types: large remnant native prairie, prairie reconstruction plantings, and small remnant native prairie with fragmented landscapes. The project focused on 2 key invertebrate groups, native bees and grasshoppers, with the idea that targeting 2 native insect guilds that have highly varied roles in the prairie ecosystem will help us understand which components of native prairie are present or absent following reconstruction. Comparing the species richness, diversity, and community composition within these 2 insect guilds between remnant and reconstructed prairies will help us evaluate the effects of reconstruction age on invertebrate communities to determine whether they're converging with remnants. This information will help managers optimize the size, placement, and plant species diversity of reconstruction plantings and may help us understand whether relocation of low mobility species may be needed to restore insect diversity. The results of the project have shown that the community composition of reconstructed prairies remain distinct from that of remnants for at least 15 years. Habitat differences are probably partly responsible. The researchers concluded that assisted dispersal could reduce these differences, resulting in more biodiverse and ecologically functional grassland reconstructions. Habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation are key threats to grassland herps as well. Many grassland herps depend on moist or aquatic habitats for a portion of their life cycle. In grasslands, these include wet prairies, bottomland prairies, and fishless ponds. Frogs such as crawfish frogs depend upon fishless ponds for reproduction. Turtles, like Blanding's turtles, spend their lives in ponds or wetlands, but still depend upon upland areas secure from flooding for nest sites. Some grassland snakes are adapted to wetlands or wet prairies as well, but require upland refugia from flooding. Wetlands, ponds, and streams can serve as refugia from fire as well. Hydrological changes, including tiling for agriculture and restricted floodplain, can have severe impacts that are difficult to address and often require a landscape scale approach. This slide shows 3 examples of grassland herps that depend upon wetlands or ponds for a portion of their life cycle. The 3 species highlighted here are also impacted by some of the same threats identified for insects, including agricultural practices and conflicting management needs. For example, prescribed fire is often necessary to combat invasive species, and managers often prefer spring burns over fall burns. But many herps are particularly vulnerable to fire when they first emerge from hibernation in the spring. Agricultural practices, such as disking and mowing, may be used to maintain wildlife food plots or during grassland reconstruction efforts, but can cause high levels of herp mortality if conducted during spring emergence or when turtles are nesting in the summer. Because these species often rely on both upland systems and lowland aquatic systems during different parts of their life cycle, connectivity between these community subtypes is essential. Managing at the landscape scale to incorporate upland prairie, wetlands, and rivers, with fishless ephemeral ponds scattered throughout, and providing connectivity among these community subtypes will benefit each of these grassland herp SGCN and contribute to maximizing the overall diversity and connectivity of the grassland landscape, which benefits other taxa. Herps, like insects, require a mosaic of habitat subtypes within a grassland matrix and require refugia from fire. Applying management to no more than 1/3 of a parcel at any given time, allowing fires to be patchy and providing connectivity between parcels can help recover and maintain populations of insects as well as herps. Fish probably aren't the first thing that come to mind when thinking about grassland wildlife, but a number of fish SGCN are also found primarily or even exclusively in grassland headwater streams. In Missouri, 9 species of fish SGCN are associated with grassland streams. Grassland conservation efforts benefit these fish by reducing sedimentation and agricultural runoff into streams, which improves water quality. The Topeka shiner, a federally listed species, is a good example. Many of its management needs are similar to those for grassland herps and are tied to grassland conservation and management, emphasizing the need to incorporate stream and riparian management into a landscape approach to grassland management. I hope this quick tour of grassland SGCN has served to remind us all of the rich diversity of species that depend upon this once vast landscape. In addition to surveying what is at stake, I hope it has begun to foster ideas, because we're not here today to remember, we're here to act. Though some of the data we've seen is shockingly stark, I find myself full of hope today, because we're here today to identify ways to work together to restore grassland systems and the species that depend on them. And I know what we can achieve by working together. Experience has demonstrated that by working together across state and national boundaries at the landscape scale, dramatic recoveries can be achieved. Remember that NABC Canada graph I showed earlier in this presentation? In addition to highlighting the declines in grassland birds, it also highlights the tremendous recovery of waterfowl species. Over the past 50 years, joint ventures and their partners have led continent-wide collaboration toward the recovery of our populations, investing billions of dollars in targeted, intensive management for wetland conservation and hunting opportunities. This is why we're here today, because if we can invest a similar level of targeted effort and resources to grassland communities, as has been applied to wetland communities and waterfowl over the past 50 years, experience has shown that bird populations can recover dramatically. A more recent example is the current collaboration to reverse the decline of the monarch butterfly. This collaboration is occurring across not only state and even national boundaries, but across agriculture and industry, in addition to conservation entities. The primary threat to the species outside of its overwintering range in Mexico is considered to be the reduction of milkweed, particularly in the Midwest. The Mid-America Conservation Strategy is a partnership working to identify conservation targets, design and promote programs, and coordinate strategies for successfully reversing monarch decline. State fish and wildlife agencies are the primary organizers of the strategy, but key to its emerging success in my mind is the fact that the monarch conservation is not only something that everyone can get behind, it's also something that everyone can contribute to. In Missouri, when a group of partners and stakeholders first got together to talk about the need for monarch conservation and how to approach it, what impressed me the most was the diversity of participants. Folks who would more typically be in opposition to one another were coming together to discuss common needs and goals. They didn't necessarily agree on the same approach, but they agreed on the need to work together. In today's world, particularly in grasslands that are primarily privately owned, this kind of collaboration among diverse entities, including conservation groups, agriculture, transportation, utilities, and private citizens, will be needed to restore and maintain natural systems, to maintain key ecological functions, and allow wildlife diversity, including iconic species, to persist. Audubon's conservation ranching program is a fantastic example of successful collaboration among divergent groups towards grassland conservation. This program partners with cattle ranchers to restore grassland habitat on working lands. Since 85% of grasslands in the US are privately owned, we cannot achieve scalable outcomes unless we engage and support the families who have worked the land for decades and even centuries. Audubon's aim with this program is to strengthen the important role of cattle ranchers as managers of grassland ecosystems that benefit birds and other wildlife. Narrow profit margins and increasing costs have forced many ranchers to adapt management practices that are incompatible with the habitat needs for birds and other wildlife. Audubon provides technical assistance to producers to make their practices more ecologically and economically sustainable, and conducts ecological monitoring on all ranches to ensure that they're producing the desired results. The third-party certification assures consumers that products from Audubon certified ranches meet program standards. These standards and certifications appeal to conservation-minded consumers who are willing to buy products that support their ideals. In this way, citizens also become partners in grassland conservation through their choices as consumers. By providing a meaningful opportunity for landowners and consumers to contribute to grassland conservation, citizen engagement and relevancy in conservation are also promoted. We're here today because we understand that focused landscape-scale collaboration on regional grassland conservation will address the primary threats of some of our most threatened species across a range of taxonomic groups. The need for landscape-scale collaboration effort toward grassland restoration and conservation has been identified multiple times by multiple groups. For these efforts to be successful, strategic, focused effort is essential. Without focus, our efforts become diluted and ineffective. If there are too many priorities, there are no priorities. Many partners and stakeholders with diverse interests, perspectives, skills, and resources are already actively involved in grassland conservation or seeking ways to get involved. These potential partners come from sectors as diverse as agriculture, transportation, utilities, conservation NGOs, sportsmen's associations, tourism, and citizens. Engaging these groups can dramatically expand the resources available to direct towards grassland conservation, while at the same time growing public and stakeholder connection to the value of grassland landscapes and wildlife, providing relevancy. The Midwest Landscape Initiative is working to build tools to facilitate prioritization at a regional scale and to evaluate effectiveness. Similar tools, adapted to focus on grasslands specifically, could greatly increase our effectiveness as well by providing focus. These tools include a regional SGCN list, which will facilitate the identification of regional priority species or species groups on which to focus collaborative effort. Regional SGCN can feed into the development of regional conservation opportunity areas to further prioritize where to focus landscape scale collaboration. Other parameters such as current condition or restoration potential of the landscape, its conservation status, and the level of landowner engagement should also be included. For COAs to be effective, it is essential that they be focused on the best opportunities for collaborative conservation effort, not necessarily all opportunities. We can achieve much more through focused effort and a small number of COAs of a manageable size than through smaller investments in more or larger COAs. The COA should be prioritized to identify where to start working now and where to work next. Thirdly, A system for evaluating effectiveness is needed so that we can clearly identify our target, the desired future condition, and know when we have achieved it. This allows us to make informed decisions as to when it's time to move to the next priority. The MLI is developing these tools and resources to guide focused strategic landscape scale conservation across natural community types within the Midwest. We could benefit from similar tools to prioritize our focus, to prioritize and focus our efforts for grassland conservation specifically. Perhaps we could adapt these tools to fit our needs. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. Some of the content for this presentation was borrowed from other presentations developed by our ornithologist, Sarah Kendrick, and our herpetologist, Jeff Brigler. I also want to thank Catherine Ward for compiling and analyzing the Grassland SGCN stats for slide 2, for doing most of the formatting for this presentation. Finally, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to participate, for all their hard work to make this virtual conference successful. I'm really looking forward to this conference, to hearing from all of you and working with you towards the conservation of grassland systems and the rich diversity of wildlife that depend on them. Thank you.